are these people?
Now, I have been screaming about mainstream, I hate the word even mainstream, but corporate-funded, corporate-owned, corporate propaganda media for a long time. And I saw this guy on our favorite platform. Come on, hit me with Rachel.
Coming to a Substack newsletter near you.
That's her. So he's over on the Substack. His name is Raveen, young guy. And he wrote this article that I felt like I might as well have written called "You Need to Stop Watching Western Mainstream Media." I was like, dude, okay. So again, I don't 100% agree with all of this, I seem to recall, but he said when I was young, the Western mainstream media that I was introduced to was CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Now and then my father would turn them on to listen in the background while he attended to other tasks. I got the most exposure in my grandfather's house instead of my own, as I was never one to watch the news in general. He would routinely watch any one of those three channels at night, and I'd occasionally join him to get informed and spend time with him. At that young age, I naturally assumed that the mainstream media were truthful and of the highest standards. I mean, they were supposed to be the most watched. They were supposed to be the most watched channels for news and had wide international influence after all. So why wouldn't I trust them to give me factual, objective information? Also considering that your grandfather trusted them. All right.
Yeah. If you can't trust the FBI, who can you trust?
The CIA and our institutions. That's right. The longest stretch when I watched such news was in the months leading up to the 2020 U.S. election, and actually in the wake of COVID. I wanted to be up to date with the progress of the Democrat candidates as I desperately wanted Donald Trump to lose. My main concerns were that, number one, he was going to start World War III with all his irresponsible saber-rattling and tough policies against several other nuclear powers. And that's a legitimate concern. Also, his dismal handling of the pandemic, whereby his lax irresponsible policies caused the virus to widely spread, resulting in countless hospitalizations and deaths in the U.S. I don't know if that was due to him or due to Fauci and due to policy in the military. It also
safe and effective.
That's right. Very safe and effective.
Very safe and effective.
It also caused it to spread to other countries and mutate into more virulent, harmful strains. Again, agree to disagree there. So yeah, when Joe Biden
stopped the spread, it's safe and effective. It's very good. Very nice.
My heart swells with pride when I think about it.
Me too.
He says, so yeah, when Joe Biden won in November 2020, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, thinking that he was going to be way more diplomatic and responsible in his foreign policies and his impact on the global stage. Boy, was I wrong, as I would eventually realize. If you had just listened to us, you would have known. Convo Couch, there were plenty of us that were screaming it, but of course, we were slandered and dismissed as kooks and as negative Nancys and people who wanted Trump to win.
You were the alt-left.
Yep.
The horseshoe theory, the alt-left. Don't worry about it.
So he says, my introduction to more objective independent news media came in mid-2020 when I stumbled upon Brian Bertelik's YouTube channel, where he regularly analyzes the U.S. government's meddling in Southeast Asia countries to sabotage China's rise as a global superpower. New Atlas is his channel, by the way. I started watching his videos regularly as they were intriguing and revealed information I was unaware of. It was from his analysis that I realized, one, just how much the Western mainstream media, both news channels and print, lie and spread propaganda. Two, that they're essentially a tool for the ruling class to manipulate their citizens into supporting their greedy, destructive agendas. And three, that the U.S. ruling class in particular is heavily involved in instigating social unrest and coups to replace other countries' leaders with those subservient to Western interests. Well, that's obvious to all of us, but everyone has to have an awakening to that, because we're all propagandized at birth through our education and our young adulthood, most of us, to believe that the U.S. is actually a good place and tries to do the right thing. He says it was primarily through Brian's videos that I became aware of the U.S. government's backing of the Hong Kong protests, efforts to break Taiwan away from China, and false accusations of the Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang, among others. All right?
China.
Yeah. He says a couple of months later, I discovered another channel called Barrett, I've never heard of, in which an English father and son duo living in China made vlogs about their observations on the social and political aspects of Chinese society. Watching their videos opened my eyes to even further to the Western mainstream media's lies and propaganda tactics, in this case towards the Chinese system as a whole. I learned from them as well that the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang wasn't at all like how Western leaders and news media made it out to be. One of their analyses really left an impression on me was how different societies perceive concepts like freedom, democracy, and human rights differently. Many U.S. citizens place more emphasis on having more than one political party to choose from, not being pressured to wear masks or take vaccines, being allowed to own firearms, being allowed to openly protest and challenge the government. All right. On the other hand, many Chinese citizens may place more importance on having a decent social safety net, not living in poverty, proper treatment of the working class, being safe from crime, having low corruption in the political system, etc. Right? The Barretts made me realize that you can't just 100% apply certain cultural beliefs from one part of the world to societies in other parts of the world with different cultures, historical backgrounds, and political systems. Are you listening, Ukraine? These are some of the important factors that Western leaders and mainstream media just don't bother taking into account whenever they label countries like China as being undemocratic or not free or having human rights abuses, which is insane. How many human rights have we abused in this country alone? Talk to Keith McHenry about that. Just watch our interview last night about that. All right. So he talks about his trusted news sources. He says, around the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 22, I watched insightful videos from the New Atlas, again, that's Brian's channel, that delved into the background of the problem and debunked much of the Western mainstream propaganda. He must have talked about the Maidan coup and spoke with Mearsheimer and things that we've been talking about on this show. One thing I really appreciated was how he pointed out the lies and misinformation in the media's reporting of those events, and also by Western political leaders themselves. It was at that time that I started following 4 other political analysis channels on YouTube: Alex Christoforou, The Duran, The Jimmy Dore Show, and Breakthrough News. Soon after, I completely abandoned watching Western mainstream news out of anger and disgust towards their blatant lies and misinformation. And he finally got to where we already were, and I'm so glad he did. He says, my favorite are the first 2 channels.
The fuck?
Well, yeah, but he's more of a fan of the Duran. My favorite are the first 2 channels, as I resonate with their reasoning and analysis the most. Plus, their more informal.
These people.
That's right. Plus, their more informal nature of analyzing and discussing making it more engaging and easier to follow. They also have Glenn Deason as part of the rotation, and they do have a good show that's grown tremendously. All right. He says, if I like Jimmy Dore as well, as there's a lot of humor mixed in with his presentation of the news, although I may not necessarily agree 100% with his analysis. Overall, I genuinely trust these 4 sources to provide me with objective, truthful information. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In contrast, my trust in the mainstream media grew less and less the more I watched those videos, especially whenever they explicitly pointed out the lies and propaganda. So I think that's Caleb Maupin right there, by the way, and it could be. He says, my biggest eye-opening moment, it was at that point that I starkly realized just how similar the Democrats and Republicans were in their destructive foreign policies and warmongering. Again, I think a lot of us have a similar arc and a similar story on how we came to independent media. He says, I thought Biden would be way more mature and responsible than Trump and would stop with all the saber rattling against other global superpowers. Well, that proved to be false. Man. Yep. That proved to be false after watching analyses from those independent news sources on how the Biden administration, along with other Western leaders, kept pushing for escalation against Russia via Ukraine by consistently supplying weapons and training NATO troops in Ukraine, as well as scuttling any peace talks. This behavior has continued since the start of the war up to this point, with the Biden administration hell-bent on the Ukrainians to keep fighting in their long-term goals to weaken Russia, initiate regime change in Moscow, and grab Russia's abundant oil and gas. He says, I became illusioned with the Democrats as they proved to be just as bad as the Republicans in launching proxy wars, being subservient to the military-industrial complex and deep state, war profiteering, their direct involvement in changing regimes in other countries, again, Venezuela, anyone? No? And stealing other countries' natural resources. Again, Venezuela, anyone? As well as Ukraine. Consistently watching those independent, objective news sources made me realize just how evil both mainstream parties really were, and that there weren't many fundamental differences between them. That's right, just the speed with which their knee hits the floor, according to Ralph Nader. And man, was that realization fully cemented when the war in Palestine broke out last year, and both the Democrats and Republicans fully, as well as consistently, supported sending arms and money to the Israeli regime, thus directly enabling a genocide, to which they are criminally liable, and we should start bringing them up on charges at The Hague. He says the mainstream media can have such devastating effects on society. Again, this is where I totally agree with him. At this point, I've come to strongly despise the Western mainstream media as well as political leadership, given the level of brainwashing and harm they're routinely inflicting on society. I love that line. Their actions have been and continue to be highly irresponsible and despicable, like minions, considering how successfully they've manipulated people into supporting the ruling class's destructive geopolitical agendas around the world. Amazing. Many people passively consume the news and accept whatever is being presented as the truth. We're conditioned to not apply rational and critical thinking whenever we consume such information. Even I had the same approach all those years whenever I watched the mainstream news up until the 2020 U.S. general election. Yet everyone has an awakening. It's just a matter of when. He says this makes the deliberate lying and spreading of propaganda by the Western mainstream media incredibly dangerous to any society, as we've seen in recent history. For decades, Western political leaders have misused mainstream media as their mouthpiece to control the narrative and manipulate their citizens into supporting their destructive agendas and wars around the world, whether it involves the Middle East, Latin America, Russia, or China. Why? So that their own citizens will passively go along and not question those agendas, of which the main goals are almost always to, again, number one, steal other countries' natural resources, install leaders who are subservient to neoliberal capitalism, and engage in war profiteering through endless wars and conflicts. Right?
Mm-hmm.
If a significant amount of people know the truth and strongly push back against the ruling class and boycott the large corporations with whom the politicians are in bed, it will be difficult for them to carry out their destructive plans. But we know that's bribery is not allowing that to happen. All right. It'll be harder for political leaders to justify spending so much taxpayer money. And again, I hate the words taxpayer money. The MMT people, their heads just exploded towards such endeavors, and their chances of getting reelected will drop given the public's anger. And that's the last thing they want, as they're addicted to positions of power and all the lucrative profit-making opportunities that come with it. Just look up Quiver Quant or Nancy Pelosi stock portfolio on that one. All right.
Which is a much worse song than Addicted to Love, you know?
Addicted to stocks? So, yes. Might as well face it.
To power.
All right. Hence, their disinformation and propaganda campaigns are ever relentless, ensuring that their citizens are heavily conditioned to think in certain ways. And for the most part, they've been hugely successful, which is incredibly frustrating for people in independent media. I don't know anybody like that, by the way. This is particularly the case in the US and UK, based on many citizens' perceptions towards Russia, Putin, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and communism in general, among other things. I think he's got a pretty good list there. There are a lot of important backstories and information regarding these topics that the Western corporate-controlled media conveniently leaves out whenever discussing them. And it's all done so that people possess a narrow, biased viewpoint towards such topics, the one that their leaders specifically want them to have. How convenient. Right? And then, of course, he's talking about foreign policies and how it impacts foreign policy. I feel really disheartened when I see so many people on these blogging platforms and in comment sections who've bought into the corporate media's lies and propaganda on the various geopolitical conflicts around the world, especially Ukraine. That's the worst one. When they laugh and say that Ukraine is kicking the crap out of Russia, it's embarrassingly dumb. This is also concerning is how some people either aren't aware of or choose to ignore the severity of their government's actions on the global stage when deciding which political party to vote for, because it really doesn't matter. Instead, they form their opinions based mainly on domestic issues and fail to accept the fact that both sides of the political divide are truly rotten and that a third party is needed, or that no parties are needed. As long as there's still a large number of people who agree with or aren't concerned about their ruling class's agendas and their reasoning for wars, they won't stop, and the cycle of exploitation, destruction, and suffering will simply continue. He says, I'm also incredibly frustrated about people who are unable to connect the dots and people's inability to connect the dots when it comes to the pattern of propaganda, which is why I beg all of them to pay attention to Whitney Webb. She's the dot connector. He says, quote, if you know your government and mainstream media lied to you about why they invaded Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s, isn't there some part of you that questions the credibility of their claims against Russia and China and their decision to send arms and money to Ukraine and Taiwan? Isn't there some part of you that goes, okay, where have I seen these types of claims before? Like the ones where they're giving the soldiers steroids in order to hype them up to cause the rape, right, Reef? We've seen that one before, where they're giving Viagra to the soldiers. I think they did that one on the Russians against Ukraine. All right, that's a standard.
Guess where they learned that idea? Hate to fucking tell you.
Yeah.
Particularly
a Middle Eastern country.
Extremely close-shaved, mustached individual.
Also,
might have had
a Middle Eastern country that is known to do that to prisoners. But he says what's more frustrating is when I see some people having awareness about one geopolitical issue, but when they believe the mainstream media when it comes to another, what the hell can't you? Why don't you see the pattern here? He says it takes such large-scale, constant cruelty to wake people up. And that is 100% true. It's really sad and disappointing that it takes a live stream genocide in Palestine with so many brutal deaths to shake people awake and make them realize their leaders and media have been lying to them about about it, as well as Israel's true intentions in that region, Hamas, and other important factors. Yeah, he would definitely get arrested in the UK. Does it really have to take so much death for people to start thinking critically and question the mainstream narrative? That does seem to be the case, unfortunately, as many people still seem to passively consume the news. And as Jett said, why wouldn't you listen? Bro, I'm losing my mind. For 50,000 dead.
Well,
we know
that's
our mission.
Happened.
Our mission. We form a militia, make Congress a prison. He says, so stop listening to corporate media again. And I think everyone here has, but we might want to send this to people around us. At this point, the only way we're going to put an end to all the harmful geopolitical wars and conflicts around the world is if Western citizens unite and strongly push back against their leaders' agendas. And I don't know if that's even going to do it, honestly. If not, those Western leaders are going to willingly ignite World War III, given their insane warmongering against nuclear powers like Iran, Russia, and China. He says, but such change can only happen if people stop getting their news and information from the corporate media and instead seek out more objective, independent sources, which none of them want to do. The corporate media aren't going to change themselves, given many are funded by the ruling class and industrial complexes that support all these geopolitical wars in the first place. It's why Lockheed Martin and Raytheon advertise on MSNBC, because nobody's buying missiles and rocket launchers from them, except for the military. He says, sure, this would at first require some trial and error, as not all independent sources are objective. However, it's absolutely critical, especially in this day and age, that we actively seek out the objective truth. Only if we're aware of what's actually going on can we decide what's right or wrong, instead of what our leaders and mainstream media constantly tell us. All right. So he's got a couple of links that he includes there. This is, again, Raveen. And I commented on here somewhere. I might even quote commented or replied with a I said, welcome to the fight. Honored to work alongside you. I wrote this 18 months ago. Very similar lines. All right. And then I made a list of all the honorees at the Indie Media Awards, and I put a link to him, and he thanked me for sharing his stuff, which is very cool. All right. On top of that, we've got another Indie Media Award honoree, Kit Knightley from Off Guardian, explaining how and why they're selling Twitter as a bastion of free speech. But again, before we get to the Kit Knightley article, let's put this up. Again, we are heavily censored by Google. We are suppressed. Even Oz was saying, I was searching for INN on YouTube the other day, and I just couldn't find it. So, well, you really need to search Indie News Network, all 3 words. If you just search INN, you're going to get a lot of stuff. But if you search Indie News Network, especially if you're subscribed to us, you will find us. YouTube.com/INDIE News Network. You can support us at any one of these places. Again, we've commissioned the Zago brothers to have cartoon illustrations made of all 100 plus Indie Media Award honorees. Those are just about done. We'll be releasing it when we publish the 2024 names. I've started to actually send some of the illustrations to the people we made them of, so they are okay with them.
Every time you say Zago brothers, I think Groucho brothers.
Sure.
Like, so, you know what I mean?
Again, co-fi.com/Indie News Network.